should get started. Hello, can you all hear me? I think we might have to go a little bit loud in order to compete with the event next door. They have a stronger uh, um, sound system over there, but we'll do our best. Can you hear me in the back? All right. Excellent. Let's get started then. Apologies for the slight delay and for your patience. We wanted to give a few other people the opportunity to stroll in, and of course we are at a UN event and things operate at UN time, which is not exactly Swiss time. We're all here to talk about biodiversity credits, as the slide before you suggests. Biodiversity credits is a concept that probably was on very few lips a year ago, or perhaps two, but we've been hearing about a lot more recently. And I'm assuming that most of you in the audience don't necessarily know all of that much about biodiversity credits. Correct me if I'm wrong. You probably have a pretty good understanding or at least a working knowledge of the carbon credit markets, including compliance markets and voluntary markets. So what I would look to accomplish during this session is to establish some of those similarities and differences between biodiversity credits and carbon credits, the markets and how they are similar and different. One of the key differences, I'll tell you outright, if in case it's not entirely obvious to you, the biodiversity credits market is just getting off the ground. The carbon credits markets, of course, are mature. So level of development is a key difference, but there are many others. I would like this, yes, I know, you hear this from every moderator, right? You'd like this to be more of a conversation. But with a group like this, I think we actually can accomplish that. Three panelists and 15, 20 people in the audience, I think there'll be really good room for discussion and for questions. So with that, let me get started. I'll present our panelists first. At the other end of the stage is Tracy Farrell, who is and I will put the slide up. She is the head of IUCN US. She is the director, to be precise, of the North America office of IUCN. She is CEO of the entity IUCN US, replacing Frank Hawkins, whom some of you may know, and who, as it turns out, also has an interest in and is very involved in the area of biodiversity credits before Tracy stepped in, a year and a half ago, roughly. And next to her, Sinclair Vincent, who works at Verra, and we'll be asking Sinclair to say a little bit more about what Verra does, in case you're not quite familiar with what they do. But she is Sustainable Development Innovation and Markets Director at Verra, and as such is responsible for a lot of the standard development, if I understand it correctly, as well as the work that Verra is doing in the incipient market of biodiversity credits. And finally, this is not Akanksha Khatri. Akanksha had a personal emergency. She had to fly urgently for family matters to Delhi. Had nothing to do with the storm. I hope she managed to get out yesterday and is with her family. And we hope that things go well with her. In case she happens to be watching this live stream, Akanksha, we're missing you. But you have a worthy replacement in David, who was kind enough to volunteer to sit on the panel at short notice. David Myers is and your title, is it director, head, sorry? Executive director. I describe him as being the head of the Conservation of Finance Alliance, which is an initiative that has been around for quite some time. 20 years, that's right, and they have been moving this market forward of conservation finance broadly, and now much more recently biodiversity credits, and he'll be telling us a lot of about some of the things that they do as well as their involvement in the biodiversity credits market. Before we start with the questions, I would like to just say a few words about CPIC, which through its secretariat, South Pole, an organization that several of you will know very well, I suspect, a Zurich-based consultancy. They, 5 friends from ETH Zurich 20 years ago graduated, and they said they want to do something in this space. I'm simplifying a story a little bit, but they got together, they started this carbon credit projects company, and they grew slowly and progressively. They've had their ups and downs, but now they are a 1,000 person, something like 20 office operation that is doing all sorts of activities and selling all sorts of products and services at the intersection of finance and sustainability. South Pole provides the secretariat service for CPIC, which is something I wanted to tell you about. The logo is down here. CPIC was launched at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, and it's, as the name suggests, Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation. It's an initiative that looks to bring together groups that do not often speak to each other. Conservation and business, and particularly finance, not exactly the most natural bedfellows, as you can imagine. They speak a different language. They think differently. They are motivated differently in most cases. They don't even dress the same. But without that communication between finance and conservation, hopefully mediated by some lawyers and academics to sort of facilitate the process, that is how conservation finance is going to progress further. So this initiative was launched, founded by also an interesting collection of institutions, Cornell University, where I am, Credit Suisse, the Swiss bank, the Nature Conservancy, and IUCN. And it has a number of objectives, which you can see here. Obviously, it's from my description, you can make out that it is a multi-stakeholder platform that looks to enable conditions to support a material increase in the amount of private return-seeking capital coming into conservation. And that is motivated by the fact that unless we get lots of private capital into conservation, we are not going to be able to maintain biodiversity for the long term. And we are here among 200 nations which are trying to negotiate some major transfer of development assistance, funding for biodiversity protection from governments in the developed countries to governments in the developing countries. Incredibly important, but more and more people have become convinced over the course of the last few years that that will not suffice. It will never fill the gap between what we spend on conservation and what we need to be spending on conservation. And that has led to the formation of this organization. Currently, 100 plus members of financial institutions primarily, and NGOs that are in this space. A little bit more information about CPIC. I won't get into it in any detail, but part of it is the development of investment blueprints, which are made public, blueprints for transactions, so that others interested in looking at a model that has proved successful, or that it is at least is promising, can access the investment blueprints on the CPIC website. Also, providing structuring support and access to financing through this process of intermediation between conservation on the one hand and the financial services industry on the other. And finally, research on the state and the promise of conservation finance. I didn't want to bore you at the beginning with anything about myself, but perhaps I should say just a few words. I've briefly presented our panelists, and I will say something about myself and then shut up and turn it over to the panelists. But my name, again, is John Tobin. I'm a member of the faculty at the College of Business at Cornell University in upstate New York. I have been there for 6 years. Prior to that, I had a career in corporate law and finance, 20 years of doing deals, the last 14 of those at Credit Suisse, hence the connection to CPIC, and the last 8 of those as Global Head of Sustainability at Credit Suisse. And 6 years ago, I moved over to, I moved out of the dark side, and which this is sort of beside the point, but I honestly believe is becoming a lot less dark than it might have been in times past, and looking to develop some of this work from the university platform. Said about me. So why don't we start with some questions? And this question goes to no one in particular, but let's establish a minimum baseline. What are biodiversity credits about? And where, what are the basic and defining features of a biodiversity credit as opposed to a carbon credit? How are they similar? How are they different? Sinclair, would you like to get started?
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Sure, and feel free to jump in to the other panelists. I will start by first saying we don't know exactly what a biodiversity credit is, meaning the exact definition of the unit. It's likely something to be area-based, but of what outcome is still a question. Over what time period? How do we handle permanence? And so that's different and maybe harder to get to than carbon, where we have a ton of CO2 equivalent, is generally what a carbon credit represents. Nature, as I think we all here know, is not fungible. So the question that we're all here kind of grappling with is, how can we define a unit that helps us make nature and these benefits fungible enough for a market mechanism to work and bring finance to these activities to help scale them, conservation and restoration. So there's going to be a lot of work over the next few months, I would say, to bring together all the different people that are working on methodologies already to figure out how can we define commonly the unit of what biodiversity or nature credits represent.
At the risk of repeating something that everybody understands, you brought up a crucially important term, which is fungibility. In carbon projects, everything could be essentially boiled down to metric tons of CO2 equivalent. We don't have that luxury in the nature space, so, or do we? What is this fungibility thing, and can we create fungibility synthetically by imputing a certain value to certain aspects of biodiversity such that it is comparable to some very different, say, area of habitat, but its contribution to the overall value of biodiversity is equivalent. You want to take that, Tracy?
Sure, I'll give it a start, and then Dave can fill in, also Sinclair. Yeah, so we do know that biodiversity is composed of ecosystems, habitats, species, genetic diversity. So these are the kinds of things we've been thinking about and experimenting with. Is there a way to assign a credit or a value to these aspects of biodiversity? And this is no easy feat, but you're right that it's not the kind of thing that's easily replaceable. So that's the other thing that we're sort of struggling with and trying to define this this credit or trying to value something that isn't transferable. So it's not the same in one place to another, which makes this challenging. Unlike forest carbon, it's not exactly the same, but at least you can sort of look at it from a global or cumulative way. But for biodiversity, one place to another place is totally different. So I think that's the kind of the fun behind all of this as well, is to try and figure out, you know, how do we do that and create an apples to apples.
And let me add to what you're saying, it's even more extreme that it is hard to compare a grassland to a coral reef because, I mean, first, the obvious, one's in the ocean and one is on land, but one has a very different biodiversity sort of structure, if you want to call it that, to it. Numbers of species, relative abundance of different species, clumpiness versus dispersedness within their respective habitats, etc. We could go on and on. But beyond that still, there's something really interesting, and I'm speaking as an outsider. I do not work in biodiversity credits. I keep thinking it would be a great direction to go into, but I listen to people like our panelists, and I realize maybe I'm not smart enough for this. But that said, one investor may want to, say, deploy capital to improve the status of a species, hence the rhino bond that some of you may have heard about. Others are not interested in any particular species, they just want to restore some degraded habitat. And yet another, they want to find the most pristine possible habitat and preserve it as such, rather than restoring it. How does an investor know what the relative value of those is? Because it's not just that they're in different habitats. The overall objectives of the investor are different. Population increase versus restoration versus conservation, which adds this additional dimension. David, would you like to continue from there?
No, actually, I'd like to take a step back.
Please do.
Because I think we've gone into the grasslands a little bit too quickly. So, you know, why are we here? Why are we even talking about biodiversity or nature credits? You know, currently, if you're trying to do conservation and try to, you know, do restoration or save natural areas, ecosystems that provide enormous value to humanity, to economies, to cultures, you have a very limited set of opportunities. Mostly grants. You know, you go to a donor, you get a grant. You know, more and more companies are saying we want to be net positive. They're trying to understand what that means. You know, there's a whole, as you know, John mentioned with CPIC, you know, there's a whole group of people looking into how we can get more private investment in nature. But ultimately, if you look at all the value nature provides, in terms of ecosystem services, if we cut down trees, we get a value. If we harvest fish, we get a value. So there's the production services we get. But in terms of just leaving nature in place, the options are very limited. We basically have carbon offsets right now. There's water regulation values, the payment for ecosystem services, where, you know, big hydroelectrics pay, you know, put a little fee on there. But for all the other ecosystem services that nature provides, we don't really have a mechanism to capture that. And so that's what we're trying to figure out here.
Hospitality and ecotourism?
Definitely, that's another big one. Yeah. So I mean, but basically, it's you know, it's production, carbon, and recreation.
Because
those
the
are the big
ultimate
ones.
irony of conservation finance is we live in an economic system in which value is created through the transformation of existing resources. But conservation finance seeks to generate wealth from the non-conversion, the conservation, rather than the transformation of a resource. And that inherent paradox just makes it more difficult, doesn't it?
Very much so, and so you know, so when we think about these things, you know, the first thing, and we've got lots of good questions about, well, why aren't these offsets? Why aren't these biodiversity offsets a company comes and does damage. Because the next question is then, how do you generate demand for this kind of investment, right? For leaving things alone and letting them produce their services that we take for granted for free, right? So, so people keep coming back to this, but we don't want these credits to be seen as offsets because they will basically could give companies or governments or anyone the right to destroy nature and then just pay for it. That's unacceptable to me. It's unacceptable to a lot of people. And we think that we don't need that to drive the market. We think companies, individuals, even governments will pay for the outcomes that these credits are systematically describing through a standard that's verifiable, that's third party. And so that's sort of where we want to go.
Terrific.
I guess okay. Just to add, at least in the way that Verra and we're actually all working together on this, is thinking about it. I mean, it's not just conservation in the sense of let's block this plot of land off and keep it the way it is, or help it, restore a bit if it's already been degraded. Agriculture could be an activity that can demonstrate the biodiversity benefits, right?
Yeah.
Improved practices could actually result in increased biodiversity, restoration of biodiversity in the soil and beyond. So I don't want us to kind of get trapped in this, it can only be conserved, we must not kind of touch the land. There are a lot of different ways for us to improve nature and biodiversity.
And by the way, if you look at the conservation finance market, you quickly realize that there are these two separate parts to it. Those that rely on generating value from strict conservation, and those that generate value from a sustainable economic transformative practice. Sustainable fisheries, sustainable agriculture, etc. And that latter group is actually much larger than the pure, in terms of monetary value, than the pure conservation piece. Tracy.
Yeah, and to link that to, in part, why we're here right now with the Convention on Biological Diversity, one of the things we're talking about is Target 3. So Target 3 is about protection, but also a very, unfortunately, wonky term called Other Effective Conservation Measures, OECMs. And OECMs offer a tremendous amount of opportunity for working lands, or lands that are under production and not strict conservation per se. They need to have a conservation benefit, but that's not the primary purpose. So this is one of the amazing opportunities for these kinds of ideas with biodiversity credits. Because if you can imagine taking an entire new set of lands or waters that haven't maybe even been considered for conservation, but may offer tremendous opportunities for these kind of investments. So I see a lot of growth for us in this space, and hopefully the results of the negotiations happening right now will continue to encourage that.
All right, I said at the beginning that I wanted to have more of a dialogue here. I want to open it up to questions to all of you, but before we do this, can I ask Sinclair and David to say in no more than 60 seconds, tell us about your institution and tell us about how your institution is directly involved in this growing market of biodiversity credits. Sinclair, let's start with you.
Yeah, so Verra is a standard setting organization. If you've heard of us, it's probably because you are a participant in or watcher of carbon markets. So our flagship program is a voluntary greenhouse gas program. We issue roughly 70% of the credits in the voluntary market. So that is where we've kind of cut our teeth on standard setting and evolution as markets develop. And so what we're doing is trying to take that learning and expertise to figure out how can we actually help make a biodiversity, or what we're calling nature credit market, to do just what carbon was meant to do, drive investment into scaling of conservation and restoration activities.
Now, Sinclair, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you made a cryptic reference to this work that people will be doing in the coming months. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, there are a lot of people and groups and consortiums doing this, and we are actually trying to come together and coordinate on all the different pieces we're individually tackling. But I can say that Verra, with actually IUCN, CFA, some others in the audience, Conservation International, etc., are working to create a nature framework that has certainly at least one vertical of biodiversity, being able to measure biodiversity benefits and then turn those into a credit that you can sell. That may cover other things, including non-living things like water, and being able to kind of even encompass carbon. How does carbon fit into sort of the broader nature construct? So what we're setting out to do over specifically the next 12 months is create that framework and initial methodologies for how you account for these benefits and then turn them into credits. And then we'll dock that into a lot of the other work that's going on, including with Akanksha and the WEF, who's looking at integrity principles for the market once it actually is stood up. What are the most essential principles that any credit that's generated kind of must adhere to?
Right. And now, David, can you say a little bit about CFA and the connection between CFA and these markets? But Tracy, you are at IUCN, so apologies for not asking you to introduce IUCN. I think everyone understands that.
Sure. The Conservation Finance Alliance is a global membership organization. We have over 2,300 members as well as 40 institutions, and we are designed to promote, build capacity and innovation in conservation finance globally. We interpret it quite broadly, so it's beyond private markets. It includes public finance, all kinds of innovative finance mechanisms. So we believe that this is a great opportunity, so we've been supporting working closely with Verra and the other partners. There's also a new group called the Biodiversity Credit Alliance that just sort of launched or announced themselves a few days ago, and that includes IED, UNDP, and a range of organizations that are actually selling credits. They've created initial methodologies. They're out there doing it. Terra SOS in Colombia does it. There's a group in South Africa. Tim Coles from Wallacea. So there's a range of people actually doing this work, that offering credits on the market, and so we're trying to all make sure we all come together, share a vision, share an approach, make sure communication occurs so that we don't end up with 20 completely different types of credits that confuses the market, so that we're all more or less on the same page, can have 20 different methodologies underneath a framework, but we don't want to have to wait 20 years for the market to mature like it did in carbon. We want to be able to offer a coherent message, a coherent product, and get these markets, and get the financing moving quickly.
Because as Sinclair said when we were chatting before the start of the event, there are certain things we need to get right now, because if we get started with this market too quickly and haven't addressed those questions, we'll be carrying those handicaps with us for a long time, right? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot to figure out, and we don't have to figure out all of it right now after these 2 weeks where everybody's been really excited and energized. I appreciate that. We will absolutely need that energy, but there is a subset of things we do need to figure out soon, and we need to get those roughly right. That will be the building block of this entire market. And then there's a lot of things that we can wait and we can allow for innovation and see how things evolve. We are lucky that we're not starting from scratch, right? We do know how carbon went, and there are things that we can, start from there where they are now, and there are things that we don't want to carry forward, and so we will have to think a little bit differently about that. So we will move faster regardless, but being strategic about the things that we move the fastest on.
Tracy, IUCN and biodiversity credits, and anything else you want to say as well?
Thank you. That was actually kind of a good segue. IUCN has been involved for many years. We're mostly known for the red list. That's how people usually enter our universe, but there have been several other tools developed over the years. So working with the key biodiversity areas, which basically help us figure out where the most critically endangered and threatened species are. Then there's something called the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT, and that's a way of trying to figure out where these places are. So it started as sort of a go, no-go tool. If you were a mining company or wanting to do forest conservation and restoration, you might want to know where these important species are. So IBET helps with that identification. But since then, we've moved a lot more into things like, how do you actually figure out a restoration plan? So this is a really wonky one, STAR. It sounds like it's going to be easier to say than it is, but it's the Species, Threat, Abatement, and Restoration. So STAR really just helps you figure out the restoration potential for a given location. And we're hoping that a lot of these tools will be used as some of the foundation for figuring this out. So what are the ways to determine what is worth of biodiversity credit, locations, and then create some of that systematic framework that we've been discussing, so that hopefully there is ultimately a very robust and rigorous approach to assigning this credit and eventually, validating and verifying.
And do you feel you said enough about IUCN itself as an organization and biodiversity credits?
I think so.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'm going to get myself in trouble.
Well, terrific. Any questions, challenges? It's your opportunity. Go after them. Yes. Well, thank you, Avril. The first person here is in the front.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. So I'm working for AXA Climate, an entity from the AXA Group, the insurance company, but we're very much focused on climate and biodiversity issues. And I actually registered to CEPIC a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to hear your opinion about the silos between credits and the direction I feel we're going towards, because one of the big challenges with carbon credits has been, of course, the negative externalities on biodiversity and social impact. And now I hear a lot about biodiversity credits only with the biodiversity part. And I'm thinking, if we have all these challenges and people here are very much aware of the nexus climate, biodiversity, and local communities, so should we not rather think about like impact credit with this 3 dimension at the heart of projects, which would be climate CO2 sequestration, biodiversity restoration, and fair transition for local communities. Of course, it's even more complex probably, but I'm thinking with the whole fungibility issues, actually maybe the way to make it fungible is through the social aspects. Because there is now some methodology of social return on investment, SROI, and we can, I mean, it's not perfect, of course, but it's a start, translate the different measures into social impact, and what becomes a common unit is actually the value of this impact. So what would you think about that?
Is that for any particular person?
No, anyone who wants to take it.
All right. 2 questions. Okay. I saw someone from, I thought Verra. Did you raise your hand? No? Oh, it was the person behind. Okay.
My name is Fiona Wilson. I'm with Earthwatch, an environmental organisation, global one, and we're pioneers with companies. So we're really excited by the idea of more investment in nature. My question is an extension of yours, which is around, an alarming statistic that the Amazonian Indigenous man said yesterday or the day before, that only 1% of the finances that comes through crediting goes to the people that are stewarding the land. And the second one is that I work with a whole pile of Indigenous communities, and they ask me, how do I get involved in the credits? And our research says the barriers to plastic credits, the barriers to carbon credits in terms of entering the market because of the compliance and so on, means that they need to use, that it's high. So I'm interested to understand how frameworks and so on allow us to engage more deeply and make sure the funds go to where it needs to go.
Are you looking for a response, comments, reactions?
So at least from Verra's perspective and what we're calling the nature framework is trying to do just this. So actually nature is more than just biodiversity. It includes carbon. It includes the impacts that we see from plastic in the environment. It includes sustainable development and the different impacts on livelihood. So the reason we're actually nesting our nature framework in an existing standards program that we have at Verra called the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, or SD-VISTA, because it allows you to then also quantify the benefits or impacts, negative or positive, on all things sustainable development, all the different components, and linking it to the SDGs. And climate is, of course, part of that in SDG 13. So we are trying to think about this holistically. What we're trying to do, at least for next year, is first focusing on the biodiversity piece, but it's within this nature framework that includes all the things you both just mentioned. So it's helpful to hear that sort of validation of that is hopefully the right approach to take. And then just quickly on how do we actually benefit share and know that it's being shared appropriately, which will be different in every project context. It's a great question and something we absolutely have to build into this framework that we're working on, and hopefully anybody else that's developing one, and something that does have to improve beyond where carbon is. There's a few ways to go about it, including, we have a registry system, so how can we build in more transparency there with transactions? What requirements can we build in that will actually be meaningful and be able to be verified on the ground of where that finance went? So it's not an easy one, but it's one that is essential for this to work, and I think hopefully that will then bleed into any other existing market out there.
So this is the problem with talking off the cuff, because I didn't mention any of IUCN's work on the resource governance side and all of the frameworks that are in place to look at all of these social indicators, metrics, and we have gotten it wrong in quite a few of the RED projects. There's been lots of unintended consequences, so we need to get this right. So that's, full stop. So we do have quite a few indicators so we can track this progress, make sure that all necessarily parties are involved beyond FPIC, but actually the benefit sharing and making sure that that's fully agreed to before you even begin. So that's another piece of work that I can share in more detail. But then also I should mention that we have a GEF-funded project called Inclusive Conservation, or Initiative for Inclusive Conservation. And it's really exciting because what it's trying to do is kind of push a little bit further where we can design investment projects and just conservation projects where people are trained to self-advocate, self-organize, write their own proposals. I mean, this is clearly where all this has to go, and we need to be working ourselves out of a job. So it shouldn't be IUCN or the other big entities that are doing these things. It needs to come from the grassroots and civil society. So this is one example project that's starting to, I think, do things at the right level.
Really quickly to add, but then we will hopefully get more questions. So just as an example, Replanet, who's starting and doing this, they're requiring 60% of the initial sale go to the communities, and that's part of their credit definition. And then the resale, because you can have then sort of investors, advance finance the conservation actions and work with the communities. And then the resale of that, once you've established the credit, 60% of that resale also has to go to the communities. And it's a really ingenious way of assuring at least a certain percentage goes to that. But in all these initiatives, what we've seen when principles are being described, equity is like central. Everyone is like, this is the good thing about developing a new mechanism at this time and age, is that we're all aware of a lot of the problems in the past, and we realize how important, indigenous peoples and local communities are to conservation action, and how, so we're trying to design it in. And one other thing which is that there are people working on the crypto side, Web3 of this, exploring how you can use smart contracts and the blockchain to really get money down to that local level. And although it's quite complicated and all that, I think that's a really interesting area of exploration, and people are working on that. Yeah.
I'm sure we have other questions, but I'd like to go back to the panelists for a moment to ask a question to whoever would like to jump in with and answer it. And it has to do with the fact that a lot of the conversation right now is pretty theoretical. And I think I'm not the only one who struggles to think of very good examples of how the concept of biodiversity credits is going to be implemented in the real world, except, well, perhaps in the biodiversity offsets, which, by the way, if anyone feels among the panelists that you'd like to explain that difference because you think it's helpful, go ahead and do so. But in the context of biodiversity offsets, perhaps biodiversity credits could work, but what are some examples of actual deals? I mean, from the carbon space, where certainly the voluntary markets use, or what they use these credits for. People who are traveling or flying, of course, and want to compensate for their emissions. Factories, and this is as much the markets as in the countries. There we go. And factories who are emitting a lot of CO2 in the process of, say, manufacturing products, or, of course, utilities who are generating lots of emissions in connection with generating power. So, biodiversity credits, what are some examples where this is going to come in?
So first off, in terms of like who's doing actions that would generate biodiversity credits, all the conservation organizations in the world are doing actions that could generate conservation credits. So the question I think that you're asking in a way is demand. So if
exactly, yes.
If biodiversity
Who's going to buy
credits,
these things?
right, if they're not offsets, and we're thinking of how do you even stop people from even claiming that they're offsets, right? This is something we could talk about. But if they're not offsets, and offset meaning is a very, very, it's something that's been developed and operating over the last 20 years or so, where a company follows a mitigation hierarchy in the right way, so that they look at the impact they're having on nature, on other resources, they mitigate that, they try to avoid it, they restore afterwards, and if there's residual impact after all that cannot be avoided, that's where in some countries like the US and Colombia and Australia, you're required to compensate for that by investing in conservation in areas that are similar. So they say a lot of like to like, in other words, same species, same ecosystem. It's very complicated, very scientifically rigorous, takes a lot of effort. There's over 30 countries that have legislation in place for this. It's not incredibly effective in large-scale conservation outcomes, but it does move about $7 to $9 billion a year in financing. So it's not insignificant, but it is a company having an impact. It's a planned impact. It's not an oil spill or something like that, and it's compensated for by either financing or by conservation. So we don't want these to be that. So then if they're not an offset like for flying or something like that, why would someone buy one? Right? Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think that there's plenty of companies out there right now that are investing in nature positive actions, that are investing in conservation. One example is, and so impact, for companies there's like impact and there's dependency, right? And so we heard earlier, and over the course of the last year, how important nature is for companies, for the bottom line, for investments, for risk management, right? So supply chains, things like water regulation, obviously license to operate. But we also heard in this discussion about individuals that will want to work for a company that's doing good things in the world. So there's all kinds of reasons that a company would want to reduce risks to their supply chains by investing, for example, in nature. But how do they know what to invest in? And so this is a way to sort of standardize outcome-based. It's in a way like the rhino bond, like you have a very specific measure that you're trying to achieve, increased rhinos in South Africa. And so someone, the GEF, is willing to pay for that outcome. In this case, it could be companies, it could be individuals, and they're willing to pay for positive nature outcomes for their own business and for their, reputation.
So that's one set of examples. Tracy, do you want to throw out some other systems where biodiversity credits would be used?
I don't know if I can do that, but I just wanted to add to what Dave was saying that a key part of this is also the idea of retiring the credits. So that's the permanence question, which is really important because the ongoing challenge with conservation is refunding the same work again, again, and again. And that's a really big drain on any conservation actor. And the public sector can only do so much. Philanthropic support can only do so much. So this is yet another source of potential revenue that we're really hoping helps us get to that idea of permanence and retiring these credits so that you don't have to keep refunding the same work over and over.
Thank you. Would you like to venture any systems where you think this might work? And if not, that's perfectly okay.
I mean, I think the main ones have been mentioned, but I will just say, I mean, there is regulation coming out on the reporting side of impacts and dependencies. So companies are going to want to also tell a positive story after they have to start telling their negative story more openly. And so whether that's used for mitigation, offsetting, or going beyond that, I mean, I think there's space there for biodiversity or nature credits.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's go back to the audience. Questions? Yes.
My name is Kushairi. I'm from the Coral Triangle Initiative in Manado, Sulawesi. All right. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Kushairi. I'm from the Coral Triangle Initiative, based in Manado. I might be asking very basic questions. Yeah, I'm trying to understand actually. Biodiversity credits. Yeah. To me, if the bank credits, that means the bank will owe you some money, will give you some money, and you do something, and you pay back, right? So what I'm listening here is that credits is more not of a fund that you pay back the money. It's credit that is the company or private sectors or government bodies that receive credits of what they have offered you, right? So why do we have all these names, biodiversity credits, grants, or GEF, or environmental fund, They are all the same, to me. Or am I wrong on that part? Thank you.
I mean, I definitely hear you, and welcome from CTI. What a beautiful, beautiful place, Coral Triangle. Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it is a little bit of shifting around the discussion. It's still trying to generate money to pay for protection and conservation and restoration. So I think you're right that that's the same thinking. But to me, what this does is engages new actors in a way that we haven't necessarily been able to do before. So we're really talking a lot about the private sector here and talking about ways of giving them, as David said, an opportunity to invest in nature and in conservation. And typically that's been a little bit more limited. So the private sector can do philanthropic donations, or they can talk about their bigger ambitions, but this is really trying to make it, I think, even more specific and targeted so they can talk about a contribution. So a very specific investment that was made to improve a biodiversity outcome. So that's a more powerful story. So I think you're right, it's not new, it's not like suddenly there's, a different completely conceptualized idea, but it does target a slightly different sector in ways that we're excited about because we're hoping it will result in more of that investment.
If a group of donors work together and name themselves as biodiversity credits, it's more of a consortium, right? A consortium of, which is composed of companies or grants producing bodies, to name themselves, That's what I'm trying to get along,
That wasn't us. Do you want to try and take that?
woman with the checkered.
Yeah, I know, I look like I should be riding up a mountain. Sorry, I said I should look like I should be riding up a mountain. I'm from Australia. We're struggling with this concept as well around types of credits in our region in North Queensland. We're trying to work on a rainforest restoration type credit using condition improvement as a way of growing rainforest and knowing what it looks like in terms of the modelling of the growth of rainforest. But I've also been grappling with and wondered on your opinions in terms of how we bring the natural capital approach, doing a sort of whole local or regional account, and how you might link that with a nature market. So people are investing in projects that generally improve the natural capital of a whole region or an asset within a region. And the other thing I wanted to raise and ask, two questions, and the other one, if that's all right, the other one was about the term investment. I've sort of thrown that idea at a few people who've gone, well, if you're just buying a credit that you can't then sell on and make any financial return on, then the financiers don't necessarily consider that an investment. It's an investment in a biodiversity outcome, but it's not necessarily an investment, and it's why there's all these other kind of concepts around linking these things to bonds or other things that provide a return, and I wondered on your considerations on that.
Right. So the first question is really great point. So in the sort of framework that we're thinking of, and I've seen this in all the sort of frameworks that have been written, one of the criteria is going to be that it fits, whatever is being proposed fits into national plans, fits into national strategies, so it supports the sort of landscape approach. You can't just come in and say we're going to just, I don't know, save this one species in this, that it's got to be part of some sort of larger strategy. So that's positive in the way people are thinking of it. And the second question was, what was about? Oh, investment versus, right? Yeah, what a great question. So, so this is when you bring this up to finance people, they're like, oh, great, this is a whole other financial market. We're going to make lots of money on nature, but that's really not how it seems to be the most beneficial or productive. So it seems that. But then if you only have what are called natural buyers, like people that, like if you're, people that have a very aligned interest, I mentioned a company interested in their watershed or something, right? If you only have them only purchasing one time, it doesn't allow for what are called environmental bankers to come in and make investments ahead of time, maybe on a larger landscape scale, which could be much more meaningful to generate credits. Maybe they take a couple years to generate, like like offsets, and then sell them to natural buyers afterwards. So you do seem to need at least those two levels. And as I mentioned before, that 60%, that assumes you can sell the credit once. So you create the credit, sell it once, and then you're done. So maybe something like that would work. We're all sort of trying to figure that part out, but it's a great issue. Yeah.
Super important, and we are nearly done, and I would like to get some final comments out of our panelists. So unless it's something that you really want to hear addressed now, we will be around, I think I can say comfortably, for a few minutes after if you want to follow up with an additional question. But in these final 3 minutes, so let's take 1 minute each, can you, blue sky thinking, can you tell us what you expect, number one, to be the next steps in the development of this market? And second part of the question, what's the longer term horizon? So where do we need to be going in the next year or so? Where do you think we will be in 10 years? Is that a fair question? Who would like to start? In a minute or less.
Well, I have the microphone, so I'll just start. It's rare that the panelists are like jumping to give those last remarks. I think in the next year, or really even 3 to 6 months, I think there's going to be a pretty big scramble to figure out what is that unit. what is sort of the shared vision, and then what is the unit, and how do all the different methodologies that have already been developed or are in process, how can they kind of converge a bit, and can we come to a common understanding or opinion about what that unit could be. In that process, my hope is that we can try to bring people together, as David said, and avoid fragmentation as much as possible, so that we can get to, in 10 years, we have a thriving market that is really, truly driving large-scale investment into conservation and restoration. I think we have to be...
Before you move on,
Yeah.
if I may offer an opinion, you want to have a quantitative ecologist in that group, but one who understands finance.
Yeah.
And I have somebody in mind who might be able to help you.
Great.
Carry on.
Looking forward to the connection. And yeah, absolutely, to that exact point, this next year is going to be extremely important to run a proper consultative process. We have time. Companies don't yet understand even nature, I mean, some of them do, but not all, understand what nature positive means, what the reporting and kind of regulatory environment for them means, let alone how should they then be investing, and what is the variation investment in the decision making they might have to have. So we do have time to kind of learn a bit by doing, and hopefully learn from carbon of let's not make the perfect be the enemy of the good. And to my point earlier, there are some critical decisions that do need to be made quickly, and others that we can take a bit more time to really test and let things evolve as we then educate the demand side. There's a huge education component here, and that's going to take multiple years. That will not be done in 12 months. So hopefully we can work together to get that common vision to then be able to start educating gradually, especially on the demand side.
Great. Who'd like to go next?
Well, kindly, you gave the mic to me, so I will. I'm really intrigued by this Australia example. I think for me, what I'm really hoping for in the next 10 years is that this becomes a way to translate national plans for natural capital. To me, the natural evolution is you do your assessments, you have your accounts, then you look and go, well, okay, but who's investing? As we talked about before, it can't only be the public sector. So I'd love to see where those kind of frameworks create that opportunity to bring together multiple investors in multiple types of biodiversity and natural capital.
Terrific. David?
Yeah, so we are working closely with Verra. So, over the next year, we really hope to have the framework clarified and have multiple methodologies, in the pipeline and being verified. But so 10 years from now, I'd like to see a very large number of methodologies submitted, because nature is extremely complicated. There are so many ways where we can improve it. And then not only sort of species focused, but really more of the ecosystem focused mechanisms, and just huge amounts of financing going to conservation that wouldn't have been there without this mechanism. However, one last point is that there's no silver bullet in financing nature. We need all of the sources of financing that are available, government financing and regulation being the most critical one. And so this is not going to supplant or replace government funding. We need that as the core, but hopefully we'll supplement it and increase the impact of conservation and communities that are working towards that conservation. So thank you.
Well, we went over our scheduled time by about 3 minutes, but I hope you think it was worth it. Please join me in thanking this great panel of experts for their contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, John.